Hello, Beatrijs. Welcome to this podcast in honor of Intact Academy's 40 years.
Yes, congratulations, Sari, with that.
Thank you very much. So I'm honored that you were willing to do a podcast for us, and you are a very experienced educational transactional analyst and many other things besides that. Please introduce yourself so everybody knows the fullness of who you are.
Thank you. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm working as a transactional analyst. I've been working in the recent years for several national and international academies in TA, which was very interesting to see different cultures and have different connections and even different students in that. And I also work in higher education with, at this time, school leaders. My background is more, I've always been involved in social work education. So my background and some of my contacts and networks are still in social work education. And I occasionally also do trainings or have supervisees from the social work.
And I understood you're almost a registered supervisor in the Netherlands after a long period of training.
Yeah. I've been a registered supervisor for quite a while, but I'm now a teaching supervisor, or it's called a supervising supervision. It's an extra, so I can now educate people who want to become a supervisor.
And you are on the verge of doing your TA exam.
Yes, that's very present for me today, because tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, my exam in transactional analysis will happen. Yeah, I'll be a TSTA hopefully by Friday afternoon.
Thank you for taking the time. So maybe it would be good if you described some of your practice. So what kind of clients do you work with?
That's an interesting question, and it's quite broad, because the answer is quite broad, because I've been working with, in TA, I've been working with people in professional development, people who are in their CTA and in their TA journey, so to speak. I am co-hosting with you, Sari, a group practicing for the exams, which is, I think I'm very enthusiastic about exam prep and working with that. Also because I have a critical note on how we have the exams right now. But the people I work with are all, in general, they are all adults seeking to professionalize their work, but also with the hunger to really live the good life for themselves.
That's beautifully said. Live the good life.
Yes.
What kind of questions do they bring? So what kind of cases do you deal with?
Yeah, if you want to live the good life, a core question, and it's connected to your professionalism. The core question is, am I doing what I am really want to do? So am I in the job that I want? Have I chosen an organization or a context that I fit in? And how does that relate to maybe script decisions or maybe games that I have chosen to play? Not aware. We all know that games is not something that you play it's out of awareness. But the people that come often have this mixed question. Who am I, and what am I doing with my life when I'm working?
And you also work with organizations, with educational organizations. Do you do more change work within the organization as well?
Sometimes, very often, it's also very much starts with the teachers or the people around the teaching team who want to know more about development in general, and about how do you work with the idea that people are not an object, and children are not an object, students are not an object, but schools don't educate objects. We are in education, we are working with an idea that's called subjectification. It's a bit an odd word, but it still is very beautiful. It has to do with living the good life, becoming who you are. And that is in education a core practice. How can we be with students and with children in a sense that they can become who they are meant to be? It's always a bit tricky to say that, who they are, who they want to be, how we can create a good life and a good world, like a world that is worth living in. That's, I think, what I do when I'm working with teams in education.
Yes, so your view goes much further than the person. It also goes towards the system and the
Exactly.
wider system,
Yes. So an important
creating a
question.
good world.
Yeah. And the question is, what is education then for?
Yes, that is a good question. What is education for?
Yeah. So it's not a question that is easily answered. It's not a question that you can have a straightforward answer to, because it depends where you are actually, where you are in educational terms. Like if it's primary school, education can have a different philosophy and a different aspect of growing up in the world, which is different from, I don't know, university work or adult education that we do in TA, where professional and personal development is such a core.
Yes.
So the answer really depends on the context, but also the place. So where we live, what education is for is defined differently in Japan or in South Africa than it is in the Netherlands.
Given all these variables, how would you describe the educational field in TA?
I think that one of the core philosophers in TA for me is Jas Barrow, and he's leading a discussion and a development towards education as encounter, which is quite different from education as a place where you have to learn
Or teach?
or teach. So learn and teach, the learning and teaching paradigm is different from the idea that education is a place where we have encounters in which we kind of find out who we are and again how we are part of this world.
Yeah,
And
it sounds almost old-fashioned, like the old master apprentice encounters in a way. Would that mean for TA if you describe it as an encounter? What's the consequence of that, for your work, for instance?
and do you mean a TA education or like for TA in general as a
The educational field in TA.
I can only speak for myself in that sense, but it really has changed the way that I am able, with thinking about encounter and thinking about how interruption is an important piece of encounter. And another term is the becoming, how that is important in education. I've grown to look very, very differently from what am I doing once I open that door of the classroom or once that I am in contact with the student. Because if interruption and becoming are two core elements, I cannot just bring my PowerPoint and say, listen, this is what I want you to know after this hour or after this day. I am at risk that when I bring myself and I meet the other, we are at risk that we will not be the same people that come out of the educational encounter as we have stepped in. And that's exactly where the core is. I know it's pretty philosophical, it's not very concrete, but I do hope that you make sense of it. I'm
Yes.
intrigued, sorry, that you say that it sounds old-fashioned. Maybe if you say a bit more about, because I'm interested.
Yes. Yeah, I have it feels to me, but I think maybe I'm old-fashioned, like more of in medieval times we had the master apprentice encounter where it was really about the relationship between both.
Yeah.
And you happen to be a master, but in some things other people are masters. So it's an interchangeable relationship, really.
Like you grow into the mastery.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's interesting. I'm not sure whether education should, like the word mastery is tricking, is like, it feels a bit confronting
Yeah.
because in the idea of encounter, it feels for me, it's also in a sense the opposite of mastery.
So it would be an equal encounter.
It would be an equal encounter with not a equal responsibility in the encounter. So the
Okay.
responsibility in the encounter is different, but we would meet as equals. But I love that suggestion about the medieval times. I'm gonna think about that. Thank you.
If you see education as an encounter, it's more a relational concept of education, really. What does that mean for the way you think about change in education?
I think for me,
Because within the organizational field, change is a core
yeah,
concept. We think about how to change systems
yeah,
and what our part in that is and how you partner in that.
yeah.
But I'm wondering if you see education as an encounter, what does that mean for your concept of change?
Brilliant question. I noticed myself that I've come from from the idea that change is about freedom, and the idea that freedom is not to do whatever I would like to do, but freedom is to be able to be me in relationship with others. So that will mean that for me to be able to be free and feel free, I also have to cooperate. And I also have to sometimes say goodbye to something that is valuable for me in order to be free, which sounds counterintuitive, but
Hmm.
which, that a freedom that is also bound by the world and bound by the relationships that we have. So that is where I was coming from. Recently, I'm more in a activist kind of setting, and that is, I've noticed that it's beginning to influence me because I also feel that, for example, that word of mastery education, that change is not exactly
Yeah.
is I really want to push against that right now because change is not mastering a profession or mastering, I don't know, the idea of holding yourself, but a change is also accepting accepting that we are in this together and that we hold a history and that we cannot, if we go on polarizing like we do right now, that we will destroy each other instead of surviving together. So that change is for me much, much more towards homonomy than towards autonomy at this point. And that brings a bit of activism that's quite new, or I don't know, has been old but has been renewed with me in recent months or maybe past year. Does it make sense?
Yes,
Okay, good,
absolutely.
good.
I was just wondering, because you said autonomy, and is there a difference between autonomy and freedom to become yourself for
Uh,
you?
yeah, so my definition of freedom has far more to do with being free in connection with the other. So being free to step into the world without destroying the world is one of the educational philosophers that but also being free to be me without destroying parts of myself that I need to bring. So that is freedom, and that has a different taste to it than autonomy, where in autonomy I am more searching for the maybe individual choices that I am making about what that freedom is to me. So freedom is something that we all, by definition, have, while autonomy is also something that we can develop within ourselves. And then I'm looking at a positive way. I think that autonomy has a real danger of moving towards individualism or
Mhm.
egocentrism. And in freedom, there's the same danger that you say, I want this because I'm free, I want to have this, or I want to do this. But the sense that I'm talking about freedom is more nuanced.
If the educational field is about creating freedom to be yourself, but also being conscious about not destroying the world, contributing
Yeah.
to the world, really, does that mean anything specific for the way you see, for instance, TA exams?
Oh, yeah, it does.
Name one thing. I can see this is something you're passionate about. So can you give me an example?
Yeah, I think that the exams now have a real summative taste and structure, not taste, a structure that's it's the end of the line. And I think it's important that we rethink our exams. And we have some elements of it actually in it towards more working with the community of practice, working with what we call in education data points. So you can create a portfolio that is part of your exam, different from how we do that now.
So it's more an evolution of self.
Yeah, exactly. And with different people, not just that moment in which you say, hey, this is a summative moment, and now we're going to check if you're ready or not. But there's more a formative assessment and formative evaluation and ongoing formative evaluation. And that is it's interesting to look with that lens to the CTA exams differently than to the TSTA exams. So I think that the TSTA exams are far too much based on skills and, in a sense, competences, which I think is not a way to examine the leadership that people are entering doing in TSTA exams.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm a master coach in EMCC, and within that community, you have to get an assessment every 3 to 5 years.
Yes, I know that.
So it's a continuous portfolio creation that we
Yeah.
have to do.
Yeah.
But it hasn't been adopted yet within TA.
No.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, sorry, that before our small talk before we started recording was also that learning is in itself so much fun. So I've just prepared for my own exam, and although I have been critical about the exams in itself, I've learned like so much about myself, my identity as a teacher and as an educator, that I was very pleased to have gone through this process. So that's the ambivalence that we need to capture. We need to hold on to the rigorous processes that we have in the way that our exams also educate students, but we also have to take into account for a more inclusive and more sustainable idea of education.
Yeah, within the organizational field, I think it's a science and an art. So there are some just things you have to know and be able to do. That's the science part of it. So that's the and then the art part is really how to be yourself in the relationship. So and use your intuition for that. So it's an interesting discussion to have because I think we need both.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, given your view of education as the encounter, as the possibility to create more freedom to be yourself and to contribute to a better world, could you give me an example of how you work with a student, a child, an adult in your education?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a group of teachers that I was working with, in which, in the beginning of the training, we talked about contracting, and I made a comment about the difference between working in a big city area or where I was with this group of teachers and working more in a rural area where I am coming from myself and living in the Netherlands. And I made a comment that was not understood the way that I meant it. And and there was one person in the room who really questioned me about it.
What
And
did you say?
I said that they asked me an example. How is that rural different than the
Urban.
urban, the big city? And I said, well, for example, if you look at people with color, there is more diversity in the city than there is in the rural areas. So there is a different complexity, and there's a different problem. And that was really where that student heard that because people are more colorful, there are more problems. While I meant the opposite, like we have to take into account, we can do something to not problemize it once we are more inclusive. But that message got totally lost in the moment that she really asked me questions firmly. And I could notice that I was getting a color, I was warm, I was thinking, oh my God, I didn't want to talk about this particular topic. I wanted to talk about contracting. And then there was this moment that I really could feel in my body that I could say, I think that this is an important topic. And even now we realize we have some kind of language that is not bridging, but that is dividing. I think that the contract is even more important. And these teachers who work a lot with children in problems, they were very happy with how I stood, on one hand, stood my ground. On the other hand, I was very open that I felt touched by our misunderstanding and that I didn't want to dismiss the question that somebody had, but that we didn't have time to really go into it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, for me, it was an example of an interruption that was there for her and for me, but also there was this becoming of, if we both are able to be in this place together without the desire to resolve it immediately, we can make a contract about how do we want to work with each other today. So we talked about respect, we talked about okayness, we talked about how you can, I think that's a brilliant contracting thing, how you can not agree with what you have just said, so that you can change your mind in the course of a morning or afternoon. So that's for me where the really interesting encounters happen. And we had a beautiful day together.
So I can really hear how you use encounter and interruption in encounter as possibility for change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of pathologizing it, seeing it as
Exactly.
an
Or
opportunity.
wanting to resolve it, because that's what
Yes.
I felt. I felt I want to resolve this and I want to get out of this discussion. But instead, I said, if we want to have these kinds of discussions, what is it that we need in the contract? And that was beautiful because we were talking about contracts in the morning.
So when you look at your career till now, because you've been doing this for quite a while and you're passionate
Yeah.
about education, what would you say to people who are just entering the field? What tips or tricks or advice would you give to people entering the educational field?
One of the most beautiful things I've learned in my TA career is that there is something happening when I am entering a room. And you can call that teacher agency. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that is projected on you from the students that you meet, but it's also something that you hold. So what is going on? What is happening when you enter the educational realm? So that is like the core question for somebody who's starting with TA. So what is happening? Do the children look at you? Are they becoming silent, or are they doing their things and they take you into their space? Can you enter their space because that's your agency? I think that is the first thing, and one of the most beautiful things throughout becoming interested in or in being interested in education. What's going on when you enter a room? Because nobody else is entering that room the way that you do. And there is
Yes.
freedom if you really learn to work with your teacher agency.
Beautiful. So, last question, Beatrijs. What would you wish as a development in the educational field? Or how do you see the educational field developing?
Well, the whole of the educational field, not just the TA or the GA one, not just if we.
It depends on you,
I think that the
which you.
first thing that comes to mind is the measurement. So I think that what we do now is that we have really gone too far in wanting to measure the learning. I think
Mhm.
that is in general in education, but I can also see that in TA education, that we really want to be in relationship with our students, but in a sense that we also want to know what they have gained or what they have developed or what have been grown of, or developed. And although these are beautiful ideas, growth and development, the measurements of it is killing for the process in education right now.
Why? Why do you think that?
Because I think that we've got clever children, clever adolescents, clever students that begin to understand that if they bridge that gap between what they know now and what they need to know, they can have high grades, which is something totally different from learning how to live the good life or how to be yourself. You learn to adapt to what the teacher wants you to know. So you don't want to know how much times in my career I have been asked, do we need to know this for the test?
Mhm.
And that's also it's like in TA education, we struggle because we don't have tests in that sense. But people begin to ask, how is that part of the CTA context? Or why do I think I learned that from you, Sari, to start with why is this interesting to learn, which is a beautiful way of capturing the learning. But if you only say it's interesting because this will be in the end of the journey, it will create a discrepancy between the moment that you're in and the process. So I've studied, or I've practiced to say what is it that we learned and what's the process that comes with that.
Still, it will remain a dilemma because when you test, I guess you're measuring against a norm,
Yeah,
and the norm is a statistical norm. And what should you know to be able to do this?
yeah,
Yeah, and if your philosophy is to become yourself or to have the freedom to become yourself, I understand that there's
yeah,
a friction
yeah,
between those two things.
yeah. But
Mm.
I see in general in education and also in TA education that the norm has been too rigid or too not inclusive enough. Um,
Mhm.
we can debate about what kind of norms do we want to live up to. I think that's
Yes,
part of the discussion.
beautiful. Thank you very much, Beatrice. And I
Thank
think
you.
it's beautiful to hear you speak about education as the encounter and to challenge the norms to become more inclusive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sari, for your questions and your
You're
interest.
welcome.